Welcome everyone, Costine here with a discussion about the Tomb Kings in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires and why they don't work very well, specifically within the context of Warhammer 3. And they're not the only race that was created in a previous game that just doesn't handle all that well within the context of the third game. Basically what I'm saying over here, the Tomb Kings need an update to work better within the context of the game. Now, the good side of them is that the issues they have could be fixed relatively simply by Creative Assembly, though given Creative Assembly's situation with regards to patches and how long they'll keep us waiting to fix even minor issues that have existed even before the launch of Immortal Empires, I would not necessarily be very hopeful that they would fix some of these issues. So let's talk about the problems of the Tomb Kings. Well, first off, Katep is an unplayable campaign. So out of 4 Legendary Lords, Katep's campaign is just really badly designed. He's on the other side of the planet from Khemri, but he needs to make his way back to Khemri in order to win the campaign. Cetra can work, but his early game is a brutal situation because you're surrounded by foes, and regardless of how well you play, you're not necessarily going to have the resources to deal with those foes effectively. You can win, I certainly have done so myself, but it's going to be a painful slog. And when you win, you're just going to end up dominating the map. Because Tomb Kings as a race, they were always designed as this more slower pace race that would not necessarily start especially strong, but would become stronger as you play them. Well, that's really the problem of them. That's really the major issue that the Tomb Kings do have in Warhammer 3. Warhammer 3 is a game far more so than Warhammer 2. It's a game about building up as quickly as possible, building a massive empire as quickly as possible, getting as many armies, as much territory as quickly as possible, and just doing very well. Like, consider the fact that Manfred starts over here to the south of Cetra. By turn 20, if you're playing a Manfred campaign, to be clear, Manfred is the worst of the Legendary Lords of the Vampire counts. But by turn 20 as Manfred, you might be having 4 armies, basically all of Khemri under your control and dominating the map. Doing that as Cetra is nigh on impossible because you just don't have the capability to match a race like the Vampire counts or others. Like, seriously, Rapunzel of all people can actually run in circles around etc. in a campaign, let alone the big bad boy of Scarbrand over here who's just to the north. So what are the problems? Well, there are 2 major issues for the Tomb Kings and why they don't work. There's also a third issue and why it doesn't handle very well. So the Tomb Kings have, let's talk about the smaller issue. The Tomb Kings have unit caps. Now, I'm not opposed to the idea of unit caps, but the problem is for the Tomb Kings, it takes them a while to get any real army in their campaign. Like, I think the Castorps handle this much better, in that you could recruit a whole roster of decent units, so hobgoblins, basically, without any unit caps, but units that were actually good did have unit caps. The problem for the Tomb Kings is that those unit caps are far more restricted. The only units you can recruit in most Tomb King campaigns, or all of the Tomb Kings campaigns, is Skeletal Spearmen and Skeletal Warriors, which are utter trash. So in order for you to have decent units, you need to get a lot of barracks, you need to get a lot of buildings, you need to devote slots to that. So that means that Tomb Kings in particular have an inherent weakness to their armies in their campaigns. That is one of the first things to mention about them. Sure, their units are available for free, but this is a problem. It's also an issue for the Beastmen with respect to this, because like basically if you're playing a Beastmen campaign, when you can't recruit those decent units, you're going to struggle quite a bit. So basically, like, first 20 turns are a painful experience, and then you steamroll the map. It doesn't create a great campaign dynamic, because it means that you'll end up being dominant on the campaign map after a point, but you're going to have a tortured experience early on. And besides, the late game of Total War is just not that great, in particular in Warhammer 3. So it's the early game of any campaign that's the most interesting, where the biggest dilemmas, the most important battles, the biggest decisions that you're going to make in that campaign are going to be made. It doesn't matter which difficulty you're playing on, it doesn't matter how you play, but ultimately, like, the important portions of a campaign are made in that early game. And that's the problem. The Tomb Kings have an awful early game, a slow early game, and once they get going, they just dominate everyone with ease, because once you build enough territory over here, etc., like, if you take over all of Khemri, no one's stopping you. Really. I mean, to be fair, if you were any other race, no one would stop you. But it's kind of crazy when you think about the Tomb Kings, because, oh, I just recruited a bunch of Tomb Guards, threw an entire stack against, say, the Dwarves under Thorgrim. Oh, lost it. Oh, what a pity. Let me just recruit another stack, and I will not lose anything. The only thing you might lose as the Tomb Kings that might be a permanent loss in the mid-late game are your heroes. And even then, like, once you get Immortal, you just don't give a shit, more or less. So it just creates this kind of campaign dynamic where you're fighting tooth and nail in the early game to establish yourself, but once you've established yourself, the game doesn't matter. So it's a pretty tortured experience. Now, Archon has a much better situation, though his situation in, like, the mid-late game is not better, but at least his early game situation is significantly better, because he starts with more unit types, he can unlock them, he can actually have interesting armies and have a more interesting early game. But Cetra, Khalida, Katep, they have a pretty awful early game, and they dominate late game. The problem with Katep is that he has to, like, Katep's campaign is a torture experience, not because it's hard or challenging or anything like that. It's because, like, spending dozens of turns just to make your way to Khemri is not exactly a fun experience. This is one of the reasons I do not recommend the Tomb Kings as a DLC. Oh, but it's one of the best DLCs. I don't care about the reputation this DLC has from Warhammer 2. We're not in Warhammer 2. People need to realize that. And I think that's one of the issues I have with the community. There are people who still behave as if this is still fucking Warhammer 2. Understand this, the balancing, design, handling of races, handling of campaign dynamics is different in free. That's something people need to get it in their thick skulls, and people aren't willing to do so. That's one of the first issues. The second issue is the limited armies. So all your lords are immortal, basically. You can't lose them, right? So whatever. Like, if you throw an army, like, your armies are disposable. Actually, you have more disposable armies than anyone else, like, including the Skaven. Should give you an idea. The only thing that isn't disposable are your heroes. But you cannot get any extra army unless you're playing Archon the Black, which is why Archon the Black has the best campaign. Because he has more flexibility on the campaign map, it's more fun. Like, the problem with playing with only one army for any kind of length of time is that it limits your tactical and strategic options. It makes it so that when you're playing on a higher difficulty, you're going to have incredibly annoying battles, because one of the ways you can make battles better for yourself, like, oh, I'm facing 2 stacks, well, bring another stack, even the odds. No, you're going to have to face factions that are going to bring 2 free stacks, and you're only going to have 1 army. It takes 14 turns to unlock a second army, and really, it's not even wise to unlock that second army as quickly as possible. One of the things you actually want to do in a Tomb Kings campaign, if you're, say, playing them, like, one of the best things, because, like, oh, you get the second army, great. Other factions are going to have 6+ armies by the time you get the third, because it's like you're looking at 30 turns plus to unlock free armies, basically, to have free armies total in your campaign. So what it's actually better to do in a lot of ways, what's better to do is you start researching the first dynasty until almost completion. If you need a second army, you absolutely need it. You get it. But what it's much better to do in a lot of ways is start researching that. Don't finish it. Just leave one turn away. Then start researching something like, say, the third dynasty, or maybe really the 4th dynasty. Complete these 2 side by side. Go to free armies, and then get things like the 5th and all that. Also, the limitations with this means that in every campaign, since there is another way of increasing armies, the limitation of this means that what you really want to do in every Tomb King campaign is you always want to go for the option to increase canopic jars. Because you can obviously increase your army capacity when those dynasties. So if I just click over here, you should always go for this. No other option in your campaign. When you're taking over a settlement, let me just demonstrate that. Though, by the way, going for new mess early is not a great idea. But when you take over a settlement, you want to just occupy it. What's also annoying about the canopic jars is that you can't get more. You're always going to get those 30, right? You can get more from like quest battles and the like. But fundamentally speaking, if you're playing a Tomb King campaign, the main limiting factor in that campaign is going to be related to canopic jars that you do have. And so you want to get as many of them, but you can't get more. Like, the problem with canopic jars is that regardless of the size of the battle you're dealing with, regardless of the size of the settlement you're dealing with, unlike, say, labors or influence or many other mechanics, but regardless of that, regardless of what you fought, you'll always gain 30. So you want when you're playing a Tomb King's campaign, you want to get as many of them, because it's not just a limiting factor in terms of your army, it's also a limiting factor in terms of your heroes. So you want to get as many of these as quickly as possible in order to increase those armies, and that, like, just the army limitation and the cost of canopic jars severely impedes your campaign. Basically, what all of this does, the research limitation, the hero limitation, the army limitation, all this does is create a situation in a campaign where, like, the first 30 turns or so, 40 let's say, but like really the first 30 turns are incredibly painful, incredibly frustrating, because you just flat out can't do anything about it except just research and get more canopic jars. There's no other tool available to you. But once you get that, like once you're at like 4+ armies, which you certainly can achieve, but once you're at 4+ armies, you are just going to end up steamrolling the map. Because it's basically like the AI can't, like no AI faction can handle, very few AI factions rather, can handle more than 3 armies on a campaign map. So once you've gotten once you've gotten to the point that you have 4 armies on the campaign map, the dynamic changes. So that's really crap balancing in a campaign. It's like, it's really frustrating. Now, this worked a lot better in Warhammer 2, but the reason this worked much better in Warhammer 2 as opposed to Warhammer 3 is because Warhammer 2 had limitations on how many armies everyone could take. It was okay for the Tomb Kings to have an army limit for 15 turns, because in Warhammer 2, if you were playing a campaign due to supply lines, you may not realistically get. It still caused issues there as well, so it wasn't perfect, but at the same time, not the same problem. That's the difference in dynamic. Because of the change of supply lines, the more powerful economies of certain factions, the Tomb Kings have basically been left behind. And it's not that they're weak, that's not the problem. They're actually quite good if you get past that point. The issue is that the limitations they have in a campaign are exceptionally frustrating to deal with. That's where I stand on that. And while the Beastmen also share a similar problem in this respect, the difference between the Beastmen and the Tomb Kings is that the Beastmen have scalability in terms of their post-battle rewards, so they can overcome the issue of army limitations faster. Like if you're playing a Beastmen campaign, while it's really frustrating to have to spend dread to unlock units and all that, to have everything associated to dread. Like, I think the problem with the Beastmen is that everything costs dread, right? Like unit caps, army size, settlements, all that. But like with Beastmen, at least if you play well, like if you're going very aggressively and gaining a lot of dread, you can increase your capacities. Whereas with Tomb Kings, you're always going to be limited by canopic jars and army capacity. And then the final thing to mention here are the Books of Nagash. The problem, there are several issues with the Books of Nagash. One, it's really fucking annoying to get them. Now, you don't need to get them, but there's a couple of annoyances with the Books of Nagash. One of them, you need to go in Ulthuan. So I really enjoyed the prospect of invading Ulthuan, fighting Tyrion and Alariel just for a fucking book. I don't care about Wolf One if I'm playing a Tomb Kings campaign otherwise, but that's a great experience in of itself. Let's go for the White Tower of Hoth for whatever reason. What's also worse about this is you can't even just reasonably, the Tomb Kings could ally the High Elves. There's nothing stopping you from doing so. There's no reason why you couldn't have a good relationship with Tyrion, who likely is going to control this Aurelarial by the point you actually arrive there. Well, they did before. Now it seems that they're less aggressive against Safri, but you get the idea. The problem with this is the problem with the Books of Nagash over here and just the book system. One, you can't get them through military alliances. So if you want these books and the benefits they give you, and some of them are substantial benefits, you're going to end up in a situation where you are legitimately going to be forced to declare war on factions that are your natural allies. So, like Khalida, there's no reason she shouldn't be allied with Cetra, but you might just end up wiping her or racing for Lamia for that book. Or Forik, Ironbrow, there's no reason. Well, dwarves hate the undead, but still. Like the Tomb Kings are neutral undead, so instead of having a working relationship with Forik, you might just be forced to declare war on him. And that's annoying, because you kind of need some allies to make it happen. Now, the Tomb Kings do have the power of vassalization through diplomacy, so that's what makes them incredibly powerful. Like, if I'm playing a Cetra campaign, one of the things I'll do is actually vassalize Rapance, possibly, or wipe her out, or vassalize X faction. So the power of the faction is there, but, like, these books are really frustrating because of the limitation on diplomacy. And before you say it, I'm going to point out, Forik has the ability of gaining his artifacts for diplomacy, for a military alliance. Or was it the defensive alliance? But either way, one of the two. The Chaos Dwarves in Realms of Chaos can do the same for their artifacts. It's like CA just doesn't give a shit, more or less. That's one of the main reasons I cannot recommend the Tomb Kings. Like, CA just doesn't care to update them. So if you're buying the Tomb Kings as well, these issues may not be fixed anytime soon. There is certainly power. It was a well-designed race within the context of Warhammer 2, and it was greatly appreciated at the time because it marked significant change in the way that CA would make race packs going forward, or we had hoped it would. After Shadows of Change, we don't know anything, but it really represented a significant shift in DLC policies by CA. So I understand why people appreciate this, but at the same time, when we're looking at this this current situation, the books, the army limitation, the hero limitations, and the annoyances that you have to go through in order to deal with that, isn't a great race to play at the moment. It's not really fun on the campaign dynamic side of things. And none of these issues, like with Norska, if you're thinking about that, none of these issues will likely be fixed anytime soon. Like, if CA was willing to showcase that as a developer, they're willing to fix things very quickly, very efficiently, instead of leaving us hanging. Like, these issues have been in the game since the launch of Immortal Empires. They haven't done a damn thing for the Tomb Kings in all this time. And keep in mind, like, the things that I'm talking about here, military alliances for Books of Nagash, army capacity, like research being faster, for instance, or having more canopic jars. What's really irritating about this is, like, these things are fucking simple. Like, really simple to fix. But it shows how little regard Creative Assembly has for these issues. Now, to be fair, there are significantly bigger problems in the game. Absolutely. But that's all I had to say. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.